Welcome to Heal Through Humor, the podcast designed for you to learn about yourself and laugh along the way. In each episode, we'll explore the healing power of humor as I sit down with guests to talk about mental health, relationships, self-growth, and the ever-evolving world of social media. I'm your host, Talia Bombola. Let's get started. So we've already been chatting off air, but
That's true.
Morgan Pommells is our guest today, and I have been looking forward to this episode, despite hell or high water, literally, that has gotten in the way of it. We're here now. We are here now. We're thriving. Well, we're surviving and thriving, and I would love it if you would introduce yourself to our listeners and what got you started in what you do. Why is it your passion? I love your the content that you put on and your topic, and I think we can have a really dynamic conversation. So I'm looking forward to this.
Cool. Yeah. So I am Morgan Pommells. I'm a childhood trauma therapist in Ontario, Canada. I'm also a coach and an educator. I'm currently doing my PhD, which has also just been fun.
What do you not do?
Exactly. Yep. But I got into this work because I was really tired of people blaming themselves for the treatment they received growing up with an emotionally immature parent, which is what I specialize in, I should say. I specialize in treating the adult children of emotionally immature parents and not only helping them kind of heal from that pain, but also helping them have really healthy and kind and considerate love after growing up with an emotionally immature parent, because that in and of itself is very healing. So those are really the two areas I specialize in most. And I do that work because, as I mentioned, a lot of people will blame themselves after growing up with an emotionally mature parent because it's such an insidious trauma, right? It's not as overt as other forms of trauma. So I was constantly getting people who were like, well, if I just change and try harder, and maybe if I like say it in the perfect way, or, you know, if I just meet her where she's at, or if I just try again with my dad, it could all work out. But with an emotionally mature parent, that's not really how it works. So it's this really insidious kind of sneaky pain and sneaky wounding. And ever since I really stumbled into that, I never looked back. That just felt really important to be focusing on.
It's not as to grow up in that kind of family system or structure is not as obvious. And it's similar in abusive relationships where it's like, well, at least they didn't hit me. It's like, well, is that really the baseline? Like, shouldn't we not be spoken to disrespectful like that just because it isn't overt abuse or escalated to physical or other, you know, childhood like sexual abuse? That was my first year of training, was exclusively working with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, usually incest, heavy trauma to carry, understandably, and overt in a way that the brain can almost structure it as like that's not right. But with emotionally immature parents, it's like you're saying, insidious. It's not always so obvious that it's not the right way because we look to our parents when we're growing up for that's who I should be, that's what I should be. Even if other people are like, oh, well, watch out for so and so, or, you know, your mom or dad this, or primary caregiver, whoever's raising you, there's still a part of the child who's being raised by the parent that sees them as this like omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful being, an entity, and like a superhero. And when we're babies, I do infant, child, and adolescent psychoanalysis. That's like my shtick with the subconscious beliefs, especially. When you're a baby, you can't even hold your neck up without an adult. So we are dependent and reliant upon them for everything. And when you're dependent and reliant on a person who can't meet their own needs or your needs, that starts from childhood or infancy and childhood, people do tend to blame themselves because we're the cycle breakers that end up realizing like, wait, something's not quite right here. So when do your clients usually notice? Are they coming in once the conflict has made itself evident, or are they kind of sensing like, I read this book or I saw this post, I feel like that's me, but I don't really want to be, the words I hear, disrespectful to my family? Or I'm like, well, first of all, they're not in the room, so you can pretty much say whatever you want. Second of all, respect, in my view, is earned. It's something that's not just entitled because you have a certain label of a relationship. Like, just because someone's your parent doesn't mean they automatically get respect. If they're treating you with disrespect or being abusive, that is more painful to continue going back with that cycle. So I'm curious what point your clients come into you.
Yeah, I mean, so today they come into my office at a different point because I talk so specifically about this type of wounding on Instagram. People come to me really ready with like, yes, I have an emotionally mature parent.
Awesome.
and I'm learning through your content or through other, sources, like this is what I have and this is what I'm struggling with. And it's like a good kind of foundation for us to really start doing the work.
Yeah.
Prior to me really spelling out exactly what an emotionally mature parent looked like, people would often come in with the idea of like, I just need the tools to either fix my parent or to like learn how to talk to them. Like it was really about the parent. And I would spend so many sessions working with people, getting them to this place of like, okay, but what does this mean about you? And how are you feeling about this? And can we confront that you've tried 1,001 things and it's not working? Perhaps this isn't about just switching your tone or using a different word or catching them right when they're in a good mood.
Right.
I think for a lot of people, especially that more internalizing type who are so dedicated to like being self-aware and figuring out the problem, that it can feel really powerless to have to admit like, oh, they're not changing.
Yeah.
Right. And so for a long time, people would come to me at that point and we'd have to spend like sessions and sessions really grieving this idea and accepting. And frankly, like we do grief work all the time and acceptance work all the time in this type of niche, but it's honestly always evolving, right? Like it's always, even you can be 5 years, 10 years into it, and you're still realizing, oh, like this is grief. This is me still struggling to accept that that parent is not coming. So now it's, I think because of the education I've done, things have shifted a little bit for the people who come to see me. But at one point it was very much like, how do I just fix my parent? Because then it'll make everything better, which of course, I mean, we're neurobiologically hardwired to like get the approval and love from our parents. So it makes sense of like, how can I just change me or how I'm showing up? And then that way I'll get it, right? I'll get their love. So that's like usually the most shocking confrontation and shocking pain people have to deal with is like, oh yeah, I can't change them.
Yeah. And I think when I've said it on, I don't know which one it was, but a podcast interview before it like kind of came out that I call it like healing up, like trying to go up the generations if you're able to. And of course, not every parent does their own work. Not every parent has those awakening moments. Some do. I worked with some adult children of emotionally immature parents where throughout our work and them stepping off or stepping back, gave the parent space to sit in the pain of whatever it was. And it's not like I'm punishing you for being an emotionally mature parent. I'm going to isolate. It was like, this is too painful to continue. I'm letting you know I'm going to be taking a break from our relationship, whether or not they still have love for them, right? That's usually included in the text or whatever they're sending. If you're wanting to work on the relationship, please reach out. Until then, I'm not able to engage. It's too painful. Because at a certain point, and one of my favorite books, The Courage to be Disliked, he talks about the theory in Adlerian psychology about horizontal versus vertical relationships in family systems. And so when you're looking at a horizontal eye-to-eye relationship, that's like a friend to a friend, a student to a student, a colleague to a colleague, and at a certain point in your family, an adult child to the adult parent, because you're both adults now. When you're looking at the upbringing, it's more of a vertical relationship where it's like the boss, employee, parent, child, student, or teacher, student. We have to learn that eventually it's going to become more horizontal if we want the person in our life. And that's where the parents, sometimes given that space, go, oh, and maybe they do seek therapy. Maybe they do read one of the books that the child probably sent. And there can be some awakening, but I recommend them not hold out hope that one day that's going to happen. It's like when you break up with somebody and you're like, well, what if they change? What if they do? I'm a big fan of that. Okay, I think people can change. Wouldn't do this job if I didn't. Not everybody can, because not everybody's willing, but why don't you go live your life? And if they do change and come back in, you happen to be single, pick it up then. So you're not pausing your life. Same thing with the parent. You're not pausing your life, holding out hope. You're going on, living your life, making a chosen family, and then creating space if your parent wants to come back into your life when you're both adults in a certain way. And that's a boundary I don't think we feel able, maybe, or even allowed to set when we're growing up in those family systems. So I'm curious if you can talk more about what the childhood home of an emotionally immature parent-child relationship looks like.
Yes. And so that like feeling entitled to have a boundary, right? That feels really wrong to the adult child of an emotionally mature parent to think like, oh, I can say no, or I can push back, or I can have a boundary, because there's so much conditioning that happens in childhood where you are really recruited to meet their needs. Like your job is to be almost a receptacle for their emotional distress. And now all of a sudden you're saying, you know what, mom, dad, like I'm not really willing to do that anymore. And that is going to cause significant conflict, dysfunction. It's going to cause a blow up, right? We can really expect that at that point. But because there's all of this kind of socialization around your role in the family system when you grow up with an emotionally mature parent, it can feel so wrong. And so much guilt will come to the surface, so much narratives around being selfish or wrong or bad, right? For having pushed back a little bit on your emotionally mature parent and had a boundary. There's this thing that emotionally mature parents will use. Well, we call it mental coercion, but there's this underlying like theme in a lot of the way, in a lot of how they speak. Everything is a moral obligation. Everything is morally right or wrong. There is never just, we disagree on something, or you see it that way and I see it this way. It's a huge morally wrong choice to go against the emotionally mature parent. It's morally awful that you disagree with them, right? So that, as a child growing up, trying to develop a sense of self and a sense of self-esteem, right, of confidence, everything you do outside of what your emotionally mature parent approves of is feeling wrong to you. Of course, when you grow up and you're 30, 40, 50, whatever, you're trying to have a boundary, all of that same guilt is going to come up because you've been really conditioned to have to agree with what they're saying and to prioritize their needs and their emotions. You really are conditioned to be an emotional caretaker for them, right? So much of the work is actually having to do things while feeling guilty. If we are waiting to not feel guilty about doing the right thing, we'll never do the right thing, right? So we can set the boundary while tolerating the guilt. We can say no while tolerating the sense of selfishness. So much of it is just learning how to sit with that guilt and that feeling of being selfish, right? And actually something I'll work with people on is using the guilt as an indicator of healing, because you're going against the quote unquote brainwashing you got as a child. So we actually should feel guilty here. This makes a ton of sense that you feel guilty because all of a sudden you're putting yourself first. You're not aligning with the system anymore. So that is something that will really get in people's way of like, oh, if I feel guilty, then I'm obviously doing the wrong thing. No, you feel guilty because you've been told you're doing the wrong thing. But if we check in with who you are, your values, what you need, the healthiest option here, you're actually doing the right thing. It just feels really guilty and really wrong.
And there's, I think, it becomes even more evident if we grew up with an emotionally immature parent that we are unable as the adult to sit with any emotion because we weren't taught what emotions are or are not, what they are in our body, what they motivate us to do or not do. Their energy and motion, they are communicating to us, and guilt especially does communicate to us something I'm doing. Like there's a difference between shame and guilt, and then there's a difference between healthy / helpful guilt or unhealthy / unhelpful guilt. And when we have healthy guilt, like when I used to teach this to my students, it's like if you drove drunk and killed someone, I don't use this word often, you should feel guilty. That is something that should hit on your psyche and go, I messed up. That was not an appropriate action to do. I harmed myself. I put myself in danger and put another person's life in danger. And maybe that guilt motivates you to get sober, change behaviors, what have you. It doesn't mean you feel like a terrible person the rest of your life. You'll hold some part of that maybe. However, that guilt in that sense would motivate you versus unhealthy or unhelpful, like on the other end of the spectrum, guilt, you forgot someone's name at a party and you beat yourself up over it mentally for the next month or two. That's not healthy or helpful guilt because it's not really appropriate. It doesn't fit in DBT. It doesn't fit the facts of the situation. So when you're looking at being raised by emotionally immature parents, of course, you're not going to understand on your own without some reading or some therapy what emotions are or are not. And when you try to express that or you go against what you were like saying, brainwashed into the, well, this is right or this is wrong, it's like, well, not so. And I've noticed this especially with religious families growing up. It's like, especially like the more like intense or cult like ones. I've noticed this with certain cultures growing up when the family system has a certain cultural hierarchy within it or acting upon the system. And I've noticed it when there is an untreated, beside emotionally immature parenting is not in the DSM or any like diagnostic book, but when there's an untreated mental health condition or when there's an untreated other like systems problem in the family or there's enmeshment or other sort of toxicity, those are like the top 3 areas that I see really that intense guilt and shame come from because those are so laden in those narratives, especially the religion and the culture for some. Like, I know I grew up Catholic. They don't call it Catholic guilt for no reason. So there's a lot to be, I think there's a lot to be said also for other systems that are almost like colluding with the emotionally immature parent to act upon the child growing up in that system.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, if you look at all those dynamics, like we're talking about a self abandoning, like
Yes.
abandoning who we are, what we need. We're abandoning getting in touch with ourselves and even just knowing ourselves, right? People like to talk a lot on social media about self love. Can I swear on this podcast? Yeah. Self
Hell
love
yeah.
is fucking bullshit. Like,
Yeah.
what even is that? It doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense to me conceptually. It doesn't make any sense to me. But self knowing,
Mm-hmm.
that makes a ton of sense. But when you
Mm-hmm.
have an emotionally immature parent, you don't get to ever know who you are. There was
Correct.
no modeling, there was no one taking interest in your authentic self. No one got down on your level to say, you know what, it sounds like you really like science. Tell me more. Right?
Yes.
It sounds like you had this disagreement with, little Johnny. What was that like for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No one is actually mirroring to you who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So everything becomes about abandoning self and caring for other doctrines, beliefs, your
Right.
emotionally mature parents' needs. Then you grow up being, 35 and you're like, who the
Mm-hmm.
hell am I?
Mm-hmm.
Because your whole life has been centered around caretaking other people, showing up for other people.
Yeah.
And you just have to really abandon who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
It ends up being this really like superior, this dynamic between like a really superior presence in the household where everybody is kind of pointed towards making sure that that presence is happy, okay, not
Mm-hmm.
popping off, right? That they're
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
actually safe in the household. So coming home from work, you might clean up to make sure everybody is,
Yeah.
or to make sure that emotionally mature parent isn't freaking
Yep.
out. Or you
Yep.
might make sure, I don't know, the various things that had to happen in your household so that it felt safe for you to be in
Keep
your
the
own
peace.
home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then you end up being 35 and you freak out at the thought of an
Yeah.
unannounced guest or your
Yes.
partner coming home to a house that's not perfectly spotless because that your nervous system is literally wired to care and to fear what might happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's less about this, like, the whole narrative around self-love. And it's really about knowing who you are and being able to tolerate some of that painful emotion because you know who you are, right? Your partner can get mad or your emotionally mature parent in adulthood now can get mad, but that's okay because you know who you are, where you are, that you're safe, connected, loved, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of continuing to fall into, oh my God, they're going to be mad at me. Oh my God, I have to change myself. I have to make sure that they're, happy with this decision I just made, whatever it might
Right.
be.
Right. And I think when we're growing up, the way I try to describe it to my clients or the parents I work with, especially now being a parent, you look at it and kids questions when they're growing up, they ask why because they're genuinely curious about learning the world, especially at certain ages like 2 to 3. Why it can be annoying to an adult psyche because it's like I don't know why. I've already answered why. I wasn't prepared for like going on trial this morning to talk about whatever cereal. Like it triggers a lot of stuff in our own self. And then we look at the why that transitions into like after the critical mind develops after about like 7 or 8. And then the why usually becomes like why in relation to questions, why so I can maybe get away with something, especially in the teenage years, like, well, why is it that way? And if it's just because my parents said so, then I'm not going to do it. And then you switch eventually. And this is where that emerging adulthood kind of psychosocial developmental stage has been extended or changed. And now there's new research that sometimes the frontal lobe doesn't even fully develop till 35 if you're a male or if you have ADHD, or there's so many other factors to it that it's like my clients are like, great, so I'm never going to date anyone. I'm like, that's not why I'm bringing it up. I'm just trying to share that like research comes from multiple perspectives. You choose if you're the outlier or not. When you're looking at those questions of why, then you go into that self-reflection, self-discovery mode, usually in the mid to late 20s, if not earlier, if some event, spurned you to go into therapy or doing some self-reflection. And it's like, why do I do that? Oh, what makes that happen? Who am I as a person? Who am I as a self? And you unlearn all the conditioning of who others wanted you to be. And from that point forward, you discover and you relearn what your intrinsic knowing was of yourself growing up that you had to mute in order to fit in and literally survive in a family system. And that's really, I think, when your life begins, when you are able to figure out who you are separate from what your parents, especially if they're emotionally immature, wanted you to be. And it's not an easy process by any means, but that question of why and that self-knowing is on the other side of that is your authentic self. And there are people who will accept you for your authentic self, even if that costs you the relationship with your family at a certain point. And this might not be a popular opinion, but it's an opinion I hold. At a certain point, you have to decide whether what this lawyer that I was listening to on a podcast, he says that traditions are peer pressure from dead people, that you have to decide, like, and probably still alive people too, but like there's deference and respect of like, well, I would never disrespect my elders. And I'm like, well, what defines an elder? Just because they're chronologically older than me does not mean they're acting like an adult by any means. So you really have to unpack that. And I'm not saying be disrespectful outright to everyone, but I'm not going to engage maybe at all, respectful or disrespectfully, with somebody who simply because they're chronologically older than me. Like, that doesn't make someone an elder. I think of an elder as somebody who is wise and regulated and sagacious and, can pass wisdom on, not somebody who's, in their 50s or 60s or 70s, not regulated, sometimes through no fault of their own, because they weren't given these skills. We look at the generations. If our parents, definitely, I think we're around the same, age or generation. If our parents weren't talking about this, their parents definitely were not talking about this. Feelings, shove it down, move on. Let's go forward. We're in a war, we're in a depression, we're in a what have you. Like, they didn't honestly have time to feel. So I can empathize without condoning. And I think that's where moving clients into understanding where it may have come from in their parents doesn't mean they're condoning the behavior. It lets them, like you're saying, be free and stop blaming themselves for something that wasn't their fault.
Yes. Yes. And this piece around like tradition and the way things should be,
Right.
we have to be able to question that. Like, even elders make shitty decisions,
Yes.
right? Like, even,
Yes.
but an emotionally mature parent will use arbitrary kind of rules like that.
Yeah.
Right. And anybody who steps outside of that is really threatening to them, because an emotionally mature parent can only handle one reality at a time. And so
sometimes not even that.
Yes, a reality that they have concocted, right? To make their life a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And so if you ask them to confront a truth that they're not willing to accept,
Right.
if you ask them to confront a defense mechanism they have, or to consider a different opinion, and it is so contrarian to the reality that they have created, it is so threatening to them, it is so terrifying to them, that you will experience a very defensive, maybe even a little bit of an emotionally coercive type of parent, because you are asking them to step outside of the one reality that has consistently kept them safe. So I will work with a lot of people who are like hell-bent on like, but if I just can convince them, or if I just show them where I'm coming from. And I'm often having to say they have such a strong disinterest in what you have to say, not just because they're, shitty people who don't want to take interest in your life, but because your information and the way you see the world is so threatening to them. You're asking them to do something that they are simply not capable and frankly very terrified to do. So if you think about how emotional immaturity really is about someone's emotional growth being stunted due to their own childhood traumas,
correct,
it's akin to going up to like a 5-year-old and asking them to hold nuance and gray. And with that nuance and gray, there might be threatening things or risk or fear, or maybe someone's upset with that 5-year-old, right? That 5-year-old is going to have a 5-year-old reaction. And so we need to stop expecting emotionally mature parents to be able to show up for us in a way that like a loving and secure and emotionally healthy parent would.
Who did the
but
work,
that is part of the fantasy that most adult children hold, is like, no, if I just say it right, or if I do my healing, then maybe they'll want to do their healing. And they're letting go of that fantasy is a lifelong process, because we all need our parents. And because an emotionally mature parent doesn't always demonstrate like a complete disregard, right? At times they have empathy. At times they are really loving, and you do have a good connection. And so it can actually throw the adult child off to be like, oh, so we are in a good place. And, I did share this one thing with my mom or my dad and they were great. So maybe I will take the liberty and try again with this other thing. And then they get burned from doing that. And it's all this confusion all over again. So it's really this, people often ask me like, what's the difference between an emotionally mature parent and a narcissistic parent? And I mean, there's a ton of overlap, but with an emotionally immature parent, it's so much more gray. And there is this sometimes very overt expression of like, no, I do need people and I'm not the greatest. Like the emotionally immature parent might actually say that,
Have some
which
self,
ropes
yeah.
you in, right? To be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I have to save them or I have to care for them in a
Mm-hmm.
way that a narcissistic parent might not do. So all that to say, there really is just a need to question, what is this emotionally mature parent trying to offload onto me? What am I asking them to have to feel and confront that they're not willing to feel and confront?
Right.
What am I triggering them with? Because they have a set of triggers that can be easily
Activated.
pushed, activated, right? It's a very different approach to relationships. You have to be so aware of yourself and aware of what this other person might be offloading onto you, because that really is the whole goal of an
Yeah.
emotionally mature parent, is to
Yeah.
rid themselves of that distress.
And the guilt.
Whatever's going
Yeah.
on under the surface. Yeah, how can I offload this off to somebody else because it's just too painful for me to have to feel?
Hey there, listeners. Are you tired of settling for less than you deserve in your relationships? Do you ever feel like you're not being seen, heard, or valued the way that you want? Or maybe you've been wondering why you keep attracting the same kinds of people into your life, or why certain patterns seem to repeat themselves in your relationships. The answer might be deeper than you think, and you can find it in my new course. Rewire Your Relationships is a transformative course designed to help you stop settling for less than you deserve and start embodying your most confident, assertive, and authentic self in your relationships. You'll explore how your early experiences and parental influences have shaped your views on love, dating, and self-worth. This isn't just about tips and tricks for dating. It's about understanding the core beliefs that drive your relationships that you attract. You'll learn how to break free from those old patterns and start creating the kind of connections that truly reflect who you are. Imagine stepping into a relationship with clarity and confidence, knowing you're attracting people who value and respect you for who you really are, your deeply authentic self. The Rewire Your Relationship course gives you the tools to rewrite your relationship story, one where you're no longer settling, but thriving. Visit taliabombola.com/rewireyourrelationships or check the link in the show notes for more.
You know, like I'm blanking on the word for this, ironically, but there's a word for having different definitions for different words. Operational definition. The one word could have, like, I could think of love and be defining it one way, and you're like, oh yeah, I know love, and then we talk about it, and I'm like, I don't think we're talking about the same thing. So when you look at a different operational definition of emotionally immature, in the internal system of the parent, it's immature, it's underdeveloped, it's not maybe developed at all, or it didn't get a chance to fully develop. And if, again, I like Erickson stages, obviously there's more room to adjust them because lifespan is longer, et cetera. But if we're looking at the core tenets, if that parent was frozen and did not achieve the virtue of a certain stage, but in fact had that role confusion and was stuck and had that arrested development at a certain developmental age, they may be very well stuck in trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority. So if you're looking at a parent who may be stunted and feeling shame, guilt, inferiority, and mistrust, how could we expect an emotional system that was not developed to allow or help or guide our emotional system to develop? And to your point about bringing this to their attention, it's the response in object relations. It's the response of the parent. Even if you say, you know, I loved my childhood, and this could, even if you word it this way, it's not true for everyone, but just to drive the point home, I love my childhood so much, and if you had done this more, if you had taken me to the park even more, it would have been like 120%, and it was still 100%, because the immature psychic structure is defended against pain and defended against being not good enough. They sometimes inadvertently put that into their child, like you're saying. It's that split. If I can't hold myself internally, psychologically, as being a good object and a bad object, I have light, I have shadow, I have good parts and bad parts, and I can't sit there and go, that's great feedback. And if we had been able to talk about that when you were growing up, right, the park thing might not be a great example, but like just neutrally, like, have we been able to talk about that more, I would have been happy to give it to you. And also thank you for letting me know that as an adult. Is there anything you need from me to move forward, right? Like, that's the framework. The parent who doesn't have that good internalized structure or that integrity, right, being able to integrate parts of the psyche, is that by that definition, then they will split off and they will become and occupy entirely the bad object position and say, well, I guess I failed as a parent. What wasn't good enough what I did. You're never grateful. I list the bare minimum things that CPS doesn't get called for you for. Like, I did all these things. It's like, that's first of all, the law in many states. Second of all, what ethically in parenting is the bare minimum to be met, made by these services. So yes, thank you for doing all that. And what I'm trying to bring to your attention is this gap that was not filled. And this is where the empathy comes in, probably because it wasn't filled in your own family. And I can empathize that my parents maybe didn't give them what I wish they had. And we've been able to heal. It's taken decades of therapy, to be honest, to come up with like some sort of functional family system. But I've lived through this too with what you're saying. And it's a long process. And I truly think the reason why we were able to make some headway in some of the relationships is because yes, like you're saying, not every time it's you know how to word it, but being trained as a therapist with all of this, I would go in and word it and until eventually, like, I think it just rewired their subconscious to a point where they're like rote memorization. Like they're like, oh yeah, because of this and that. And that's not the case for everyone. I'm not saying that like just keep trying harder and it'll eventually work. It required space, boundaries. It required, honestly, having a child changed a lot, because there were a lot of boundaries of, if you want to have this child in your life, you can't do these things. Sorry, like these are the rules of engagement. If you want to, I'm not saying you can't engage with the child, but if you'd like to engage with the child, it has to be under these pretenses, take it or leave it. Not every family does that work for. And the ones who, that's usually where the generational shift comes up again. Not every parent will do it to the level you want, but it is that split good object, bad object. And the role of everybody, not parent or child aside, is to work on integrating and being an integrated person in your psyche of understanding, I done wrong, I can do right without the moral piece of it. There's going to be things that I do that people like. There's going to be things I do that people don't like. Is it all centered around me knowing my authentic self and not getting defensive if somebody brings this to my attention, and being understanding and going, wow, that took a lot of vulnerability and courage for this person to voice that to me. How can I, but that's, again, it's more advanced psychological, I think, structuring that allows a person to not split when they're confronted with, hey, I didn't like this thing that you did.
Yes, it's a big ask for someone who might not have that actual capacity, right? To be so self-aware. I mean, emotional immaturity is a spectrum, is a scale. And at times we all exhibit some form of emotional immaturity, right?
Of course.
Right? Like we all, cry, we regress in various ways, right? And so when we're dealing with an emotionally mature parent, it's usually past a threshold where like the functional, healthy stuff is not enough. It doesn't outweigh the bad stuff, right? The really painful stuff. And that's when adults really get tired of like, okay, these like 3 times where I do see you and it's great are great. But then that one huge blowout is so huge, and I can't bring myself back from that. It's like the 3 good times wasn't good enough to pad the bad times.
It. Right. Totally.
Yeah. And an emotionally mature parent, like they really do take feedback and criticism and boundaries as rejection. Right? Yes. You don't want access to me anymore. Oh my God.
I'm not good enough. Yeah.
But if they had the capacity to be emotional and vulnerable with that language of like, okay, right now I'm feeling not good enough, we'd be in a completely different state, right? But we don't ever get there with them. Instead, they offload their distress onto their child. They become defensive. They may even coerce the child into thinking or believing something different. There's a ton of projective identification.
Enmeshment. Yep.
Totally. Yeah. Right. With this type of parenting. So this is why people end up coming to me, because they feel so confused on who they are. And they're sometimes just asking me like, am I a bad person? And I would love to take the role of no, like all the reassurance in the world, but that doesn't really help anybody either if I just, tell them no. So we really have to sift through like, what are all the various dynamics happening at once, and where did you try to have some autonomy, and how did that backfire? Because that attempt to really branch out and be your own person and think differently, right? That is so threatening to the emotionally mature parent who found such comfort and solace in controlling you and being the operator of all the dynamics. And now you're threatening their ability to control situations, because control for them was safety, right? They probably grew up in a lot of chaos. There was a lot of pain, right? And so now you're saying, I'm actually not on board with that. And their whole system is exploding and they don't know what to do with that. So a boundary isn't just, oh, that hurt me, and I'm going to sit with that for a second. A boundary is, you're selfish. Blood is thicker than water. I didn't raise you like this, right?
That is honestly, Morgan, that is my favorite line when parents say that, especially when we're in family therapy, and I will react just as I did. I say, excuse me, then who did? Are there other family members I am not made aware of that need to be in the session? And I'll be blunt. Like that's, I think also I'm abrasive at times, but with love. I don't know what a good label for that would be, but like I put, it's like a cake and it might be a little gritty, but like there's icing on there. It'll go down easily if you chew it enough. That I call that out because then it's confronting. I think true therapy that is aimed at systemic change, especially in family systems therapy. So I see it like a little, those families are already willing to come in, or they're maybe at their wits end, that they're like, we have to try to make this work, or this is our last ditch effort. I wish they'd come in sooner, but everybody comes in when it's the right time, ethereally. So when they're coming in, it's like, then who raised you? And this is where it's like really important to highlight, that shows the parent psychic structure of, I truly thought that you would ingest all that I was giving you, or like baby bird it into your subconscious, and that you would never create an autonomous functioning being separate from how I envisioned you. There's this one meme that I saw, and it was like, I don't care, I'm going to butcher it. It's basically something like, I don't care, like my child can be whatever they want when they grow up. And then something about like picking what kind of doctor they are. Like it like says, it gives you hope that they can be anything they want, but then it's like very specific of like, as long as they're this or that, or like, I don't care what you are as long as it's this. So yes, who else raised you? And that does go again to highlight that internal structure of, I didn't intend for my raising you to be this way. And now that you're trying to separate from my control and who I told you should be, I feel confronted. I don't like that. I didn't raise you to not comply, is essentially, I think, the translation for a lot of parents, rather than it's like, I didn't raise you this way. No, actually, you did raise me in a way that caused me to want to defect from how you raised me. So inadvertently, you did raise me to be this way by demonstrating that it's not the best way for me to be is how you are. So yeah, that, sorry for the tangent, but that really gets me going.
Well, it relates so much. And I go on about this in various circles about how the emotionally mature parent is like an expert at creating what I call the who do you think you are wound.
Oh, let's do this.
And it's just like, it's this whole
audacious
experience internally, right? Of just like, you had a boundary. Who do you think you are doing that?
How dare you? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and so it's just this deep sense of like, you thought you could give a presentation at work and do well, or you thought you could defy me, you thought you could get off that diet, you know, all of these things, like, who do you really think you are? And so when I hear, I didn't raise you that way, or this is not what I expected for us, it's all that same stuff of who do you think you are, which really is a testament to like, I was trying very hard to keep you under my thumb. Right? I was trying very hard.
Don't escape.
Exactly. Yeah. And now you've broken free and I'm terrified. I don't know what to do with that. Right. And for them, like it is actually very terrifying, because it's like, how do I keep connection? Will somebody still love me?
Correct.
Right? Like
it brings up all those abandonment fears.
Absolutely. But it comes out as such this, like, how could you be so audacious? How could you take up so much space? Right?
How dare you do what I can't do, or was never allowed to do, never knew how to do. There's envy. I think if I'm curious to get your perspective on this as well. In my view, I do think a lot of the times when somebody has such a strong reaction or a projective reaction to whatever content shared, either verbally on media, what have you, because that's a whole new thing with family systems of like, well, I saw that you shared this, and it's like, it's not about you. Like, I didn't tag you, I didn't write like, this is specifically for so and so, and I want them to know. Like, it just goes to show, it's like, it's basically an unofficial projective test that was taken personally, that if there's content shared, there's content brought up by that, it triggers the person who's consuming that content to go somewhere in their mind, to have a reaction. And it's like the audacity of like, well, how dare you defect away, or those expectations. It's like, oh, but what did you expect? Did you expect that I would just do as you thought for the rest of our lives? And it goes to show how much centering your role around controlling or caring for, like codependent traits of like caring and giving for other people. What if they eventually all like get better and leave, or pass away, or what have you? If you look at different versions of, again, operational definition of caregiver, who are you if you're not being defined as who you're controlling or who you're caring for? And I think that's where the confrontation comes in, of that abandonment piece of, well, how do we stay connected if it's not me ruling over your life? Essentially, my view of parenting is she will eventually become, hopefully, a very autonomous self, always welcome back, unconditional love and regard, and also fly the nest, but come back whenever you need to roost. And my goal is that we are close when she grows up, but I'm not going to force it. And I'm going to understand if she has her own boundaries, if she has her own, you failed at this, if I'm waiting for the day. I have actually a little journal of things where I imagine she might come back to me for, that when she brings it up, I'll be like, I'm glad you asked. I actually thought of it on this day at this time. What can I do to help mend this? Because that's the goal. That I already know that. And I have a bias, obviously, having studied this and like lived, eat, and breathe it for the last, 17 years, that like, that is my soul's purpose, is to hope that she doesn't have to heal from childhood trauma I had to. Everybody has their own versions of trauma, of course, but being intentional about, that's the goal. It's not, I don't expect to be best friends with her. Would I love it? Sure. But that's not appropriate at certain ages to be best friends. And I don't want her to be my only friend. Like, I've worked with parents who are like, my kid's my best friend. I'm like, I don't think that's as healthy as you think it is. Like, what about other adults maybe that have like that vertical, horizontal relationship? So it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes, this is why I have such a strong reaction to when parents say, like, I just see my kids as an extension of me. And I'm like, you shouldn't. You should see them as their own person.
No.
If they're an extension of
Yeah.
you, that implies so much control, so much coercion, so much manipulation, so much
Unlived life.
molding.
Yeah. That's the young quote. The greatest burden a child can carry is the unlived life of the parent. And that's what you're touching on with narcissism versus emotional immaturity. They overlap because self-psychology, all of us have narcissistic traits. All of us do. It's how well they're integrated or not, and what causes them to flare up or not, that delineates if it's a diagnosis or if it's an immature function. So what you're, touching on too with, is it a narcissistic parent or is it an emotionally immature parent? They do overlap because those traits come, you've met a toddler, they're tyrannical. Everybody has a big ego at that age. Ideally, the parent's job is to mold, shape, integrate, rein it in, where it's like, yes, you are the center of your own universe. You are also part of the world. So you have to learn to balance those two traits, and you will get some of what you want. You will not get everything you want. How can we teach you to tolerate when you don't get what you want? And how can we teach you to celebrate and appreciate when you do get what you want? So there's not that narcissistic entitlement spectrum or the woe is me, all the guilt, shame, lack of, or the inferiority. That's not what it's so much. I could talk to you for hours.
No, you're 100% right. Yeah. And this is where we see a ton of destructive entitlement of like, I am owed these things. You are obligated to provide these for me because I provided them for you, or because I've done all these things for you.
Or I'm the parent, you're the child.
Exactly. Like, I've just put you in this role of owing me. And when you don't show up for that, bad things happen. I'm angry. I slam cupboards. I slam doors. I yell at you. I take things away, right? I like really lay into your sense of self. I really punish you, right? So which is why there's so much terror inside the adult child. There's so much terror, and we're working really slow in trauma therapy because it can be really painful to unleash all of that terror. And all of a sudden their world is upside down. It gets a little, honestly, it gets a little existential of like, where do I belong? Who am I? What is the world? Where do I fit in it? Because there was no kind of tethering to something safe and secure. It really feels like you're kind of off floating in the ether and hoping something can kind of get you out of that. So there is all this internal terror because of the terror of the emotionally mature parent and what they really instilled in you. But we have to work at that layer by layer, because you can't be terrified while also living your best life as an adult. You can't be terrified while being a healthy parent. You can't be terrified to hurt your parents or make them upset in some way while also having healthy love. Like, these things are in direct contradiction. So it's wildly painful, and it takes a hot minute to be able to really pull back those layers. But once people do, they describe it as being so liberating, because you're really freeing yourself from this really internal imprisonment of your own emotions and thoughts.
And what you're saying as well, with it's like almost like a fear hot potato. It's really what's happening is the parent can't tolerate their own fear, so they introject it, like subconsciously insert it into the child, and now the child feels like, well, that's my fear. Well, who am I as a self, right? Both people are wondering that. If you look at the hierarchy, like, who am I as a self? But I'm afraid, and I'm like an adult in sheep's clothing. I'm supposed to be this parent, but I don't feel like that. When will I ever feel like an adult? Uncomfortable. I'm either going to sublimate those feelings or interject them into my child, and now my child has to bear the burden of my unlived life, my unmet emotional needs, while also not honoring that they are an autonomous, independent self. Like you're saying, children to the degree that if they grow inside of you and you have an umbilical cord attached to them, then they are literally an extension of yourself. Past that, this is like kind of my theory, and I've worked on this in my analytic training. One of my papers that I was writing, like the capstone or whatever it was, is the concept. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had this, but the concept that I think I thought of, I don't know, that the parent has their child connected to them for so long, especially if they grew inside of you, and they are kind of either messily or strategically trying to reconnect that umbilical cord for the rest of the child's life. And sometimes it's in a healthy way of like, let's stay connected but distance, right? Kind of like what's that movie, Interstellar, where they're like on the space thing, kind of like we're in the same ethers but we're our own independent selves. And that's where modeling being an autonomous independent self as an adult. One role I have is a parent. That is not my entire identity. One role I have is a therapist. It's not my entire identity. Certain seasons, it takes up more of my, chronological time, but by no means is it like that's the only thing that I do in life. What happens when your child that you're parenting, if that's your only role, becomes an adult and they don't need you to parent in the same way, and they're not coming to you with, Mom, should I do that? Mom, should I do this? Like borrowing your frontal lobe if it's developed, essentially. Eventually, like the goal is like, what should I do and why should I do it? Then, hey, I'm thinking about doing these things, right? The critical thinking gets a little bit more crystallized. And then eventually in adulthood, it's, I did this thing. And you announce what you've done rather than asking the questions of what's the right thing or what I ought to do. And you announce it, and then you hope that they are accepting of it. But then really the highest echelon of adulthood is like, I did this and I don't really give a fuck if you like it or not, because I like it. It represents who I am as my authentic self. And if you don't, I have a ton of people in my corner who I have built relationships with along the way who support me in that. I wish you could. It'd be an honor if you could walk alongside me in this journey, but if not, I'll be okay. And that's really, I think, the peak that I think you do as well, because you're smiling very largely. Like that's what you want clients to get to.
That's healing. That's healing, 100%.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
What a dynamic. I feel like I can go like give a speech now. I want to like run for president or something. Ooh, I'm fired up. I want to go in like classrooms and wait for parents to do pickup and be like, are you emotionally immature? Because I have a podcast for you to listen to.
I know, it gets me really fired up too. I was teaching all day yesterday and I was just like, who else wants to hear this? Because I could do another keynote right now.
I will say, before we wrap up, I will say that I have, I used to teach, what was it called? They changed the name. It was like psychology of adjustment, and then like basically life and relationships. We go through Erickson's stages, but we use the book Corey and Corey, I Never Knew I Had a Choice. Phenomenal textbook. If you're listening to this, you can read it on your own. You don't need to take the class for it. It goes through like infancy all the way to death with like values and belief systems. It covers everything. It was my favorite class to teach. And I had I started it in like 2019, I think. So over the years, obviously with COVID, we were virtual, we were this. By the end of some of my semesters when I was fully online, I had parents Zooming in. I had families sitting there listening to the lessons. I had one time I gave a keynote speech and one of my former students had brought her mom to this healing conference. Like it was so cool to see how approaching it from like obviously a non-blaming perspective, but how we've approached it today. Like you should feel some of these uncomfortable feelings. They're not permanent. I'm here to tell you, if you work through them, you could have a better relationship. And being able to have a 16-week course to teach them was so cool to have the feedback from the students after, like, this not only changed, like, thanks for the grade or whatever, but like this changed my whole life. Like I can actually talk to my mom now, or I was able to move out of I get chills. Like it inspires them to do what they never thought possible. And for the parents to hear it from neutral, I'm not their therapist, I'm their professor. All I'm doing is professing what this knowledge is. It's their choice to do with what they want. But I had a lot of families that ended up joining in the Zooms, or they would bring, like, people would bring their partners to class for the love and relationships one, they'd bring their parents to class for the parenting ones. It's like bring your friend to work day, and they would love it. And I'd have parents come up after and be like, thank you, you actually said it in a way that I could digest. And then I'd have some that are like, who are you to say this? And I'm like, here's a referral for a therapist. I know a great family therapist. It's not me. You should go. Yeah, it's so good.
Not
I think the work can heal. And if you're listening to this and you like this episode, please reach out to Morgan or I and let us know like what parts really stood out. If you want more of it, I'd love to have you back to talk about any of the
Yeah.
nuances we were able to get into, just scratching the surface today, and share it with a friend. If you like this, like, I want this out there more. This was a very dynamic discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. We should definitely do it again.
You're welcome. Yeah. Let me know your schedule and then we'll get something lined up.
Sure.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Heal Through Humor. If you like the show, can you please go on your favorite platform and like, rate, review, subscribe, all of the terms that we usually throw out. I would really appreciate it, and I would love to get more listeners just like you in front of the podcast. And if you have an idea for a guest, please feel free to DM me at Talia Bombola. I would love to hear from you. Until then, I will see you on the next episode. Take care.